Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to CLS Live. This is a live stream series presented by the publishers of Contact Lens Spectrum. My name is Philip Morgan. I am today's co-host, and I am welcoming you once again to Manchester. Now, over the last 3 episodes, I've joined guests from around the world to discuss contact lens prescribing, firstly in Europe, then a session on Asia, and we finished in last month's broadcast with Latin America. So to bring this all back together, I'm going to be joined today by the main host of CLS Live, Dr. Jason Jedlicka, who's going to be joining me, and we're going to discuss what we've learned and what we've heard for the last 3 episodes. So Jason, it's good to welcome you back and pass the baton back to you. How have you been?
I've been well, and I thank you. The passing is a smooth process, and but you did a great job. I really appreciated the insights from that series. So as we talk today about that, kind of wrapping it up, it'll be fun to just talk about your impressions, and I'll share mine and go from there. So
sure. Well, let's get going, maybe.
All right. Well, so I did have the pleasure of watching each of the episodes, and I thought as I was going through them, there were some recurring themes that I thought were interesting and that I didn't really expect. But I think we can talk about that today. Of course, the process of going through this series was to see how different parts of the world prescribe contact lenses, how they're fitted, the type of lenses that are used, and then also how patients obtained those lenses different ways. And each of the 3 regions of the world that you looked at were similar in how different the individual countries within that region were. You had, in all of the regions, you had countries where contact lenses are only fitted and prescribed by ophthalmologists, some by optometrists, and some by contact lens trained technicians. And I thought it was interesting that within each of the region, it had a very similar feel to how diverse contact lenses are handled. And so would you agree with that? Was that your impression too, how the things were different country to country?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that, Jason. That's a good observation, and it was interesting how similar these discrepancies were, if you like. I mean, looking at Europe, we had Kristina Grubcheva. She was in Bulgaria, sort of representing Eastern Europe, and that's certainly where contact lenses is pretty much an ophthalmology game, if you like. They're very much the profession that's in charge. Although I was interested, one insight she gave us was, how there is now a move to get more optometrists trained, and for us, I suppose, to be more involved with contact lenses. When we were in Northern Europe, then this would apply across all of Scandinavia, and really for much of Western Europe, contact lenses, is the remit of optometrists. We heard from Anne Elizabeth Istenes from Oslo, or from Kongsberg, who sort of explained that. So that's what we saw in Europe, and that, as you say, Jason, that sort of model we could then transplant over to Asia, where Japan is like the equivalent of Eastern Europe. Japan, it's ophthalmologists, they're in charge, but as we move to other places, it's the market's a little bit looser. Optometrists having more involvement. Actually, one interesting thing we learned in the Asia discussion with Kauri Tan, who was our correspondent in Singapore, was that in some places the sort of different types of contact lens prescribing is regulated differently. So I think the main example here would be in China, where orthokeratology, and mainly, of course, used for myopia control in children, that form of contact lens practice is a hospital-only pursuit. So you've got to go to a hospital to be fitted with those lenses. Other forms of contact lenses more widely and generally available. So that's sort of how it works in China. And when I spoke with Martin Edison in Colombia, we similar things perhaps going on in Latin America, where Brazil is the ophthalmology dominated, and the rest of the continent a bit more optometry. So yeah, they're similar in as much as they're different. These differences
Yeah.
seem to apply in a somewhat similar way in these 3 different regions, and that's really quite interesting when you consider it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I kind of expected to find that Europe was generally one way, and maybe Latin America was, but it wasn't. It was within each region. It was the same story in that how different each individual country was, and so I think it's fascinating, and how we've ended up here, because I think that in a lot of ways, the evolution of contact lens prescribing has happened very much on a localized basis. So it's
Yeah,
not surprising.
for some reason, each country, it's more or less, it's been somewhat isolated and developed its own rules over the past, well, 50 years, let's say, with the with soft lenses coming to the fore, and we've ended up now with sort of slightly different rules and regulations, and yeah, even in Europe, where the countries are, often fairly similar, got a similar kind of history, but we've ended up in quite a different place. So it's really interesting to consider that, I think.
Is there I mean, as the world gets smaller every year, is there room for us to bring some unity to this practice, or is it not a problem?
Well, I think that I think that would be desirable if it were possible, because I think it does this. As we go across national borders, to think that there's a whole different infrastructure for contact lens prescribing, I think is problematic. I mean, one way it must be problematic, I think, is for the companies and their support, their professional support for the professionals there. If they want to, organize a conference or an event or work with professional associations, well, in some parts it's the optometric associations, other the ophthalmology. In other countries it's much less regulated, and I'm not quite sure how it would work there at all. So that's I think an issue. It also strikes me a key difference here is around education. I mean, you and I are sort of familiar with the kind of westernized university training of contact lenses. That's our background, with lectures and classes and organized clinics and residencies and placements and everything like that. And that works well in a more sort of optometric world. But in an ophthalmological world, there's much more, I think, at least in some parts of the world, much more kind of on the job training. That's certainly how it works in Japan. It just forms part of, the trainee ophthalmologists are just picking up things as they work alongside the more senior ophthalmologists. And as I understand it, in Japan, for example, there's not really a formal course. So all of these things, I think, just must bring about rather logistical and organizational inefficiencies. And I do wonder what happens in other disciplines as well. I don't really know. I'd have to sort of think about this and look at it a bit more. But I imagine for, I don't know, dental services or something like this, there's probably less variation in practice around the world. I'd like to understand a little bit more. But to your question of should we try and bring some unity about, I think, well, I'd like to think that our broadcast here has some influence, and contact lens spectrum has to influence, but it might well be beyond us, because sometimes we're talking about professional bodies and legislators all working together to bring about one set of rules, and you can imagine the disputes there would be, and how it would be difficult to have similar law, etc., given where we are now. So I suspect we'll have to continue to work with these variations in the future, Jason.
Yeah, and I think part of it comes down to that the differences in the different eye care professionals existed before contact lenses existed, and so for that to normalize, it will be difficult. It would take probably a push from education and from companies, and I would be surprised if it happened in the near future, for sure.
Yeah, I would agree. Who knows? You can never predict the future exactly, but I think there's probably other priorities that professional organizations and legislators are going to be worried about. So we just might have to live with it for the foreseeable, I think.
For sure. So let's switch gears a little bit about the process of fitting, or what types of lenses are prescribed. Again, diversity within each region, but a little bit less so. There, you could see a little bit more of a trend where one region was more heavily adapted to daily disposable lenses versus reusables. Can you summarize a little bit about what you found between the three different regions, and in the types of lenses that are more heavily used,
Yeah.
what the focus of the fitters was?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, these difference in lenses which are prescribed? Because fundamentally, the person on the other side of the slit lamp, the person receiving the lenses, the patients, presumably all pretty much want the same thing, and yet we have these great differences in the range of lenses which are prescribed. So perhaps three examples come to mind here. Daily disposables, great diversity here, enormously popular in Northern and Western Europe in particular, in Japan and in North America, not quite perhaps to the same extent, but very common, of course, in the US and Canada. We don't see much in terms of daily disposables in Eastern Europe or in Latin America. Another difference I think about is the level of lenses prescribed for myopia control or myopia management. Much more prominent really in the Asian markets.
Mhm.
And then if we get into a little bit more detail, interesting that whereas we fit a lot of soft torics in most parts of the world, less so we heard in Taiwan and Japan and those sorts of areas. So, you asked about how can we explain this? Well, I think probably different explanations for different differences for differences in lens type. So daily disposables, I think there is and we've shown this in a paper. There's a role I think in affluence. National affluence does seem to be associated with proportion of daily disposables. The richer nations prescribe and patients buy more daily disposables, which I guess makes sense. Sometimes it's more obvious, I guess. Myopia management is going to go where we've got a lot of myopia, and when myopia is well understood. So the big urban centers of Asia, that probably accounts for that. And then finally, I think education and training, as I've already hinted at, I think does play a role in some of these differences. I am struck that we have low rates of toric prescribing in the ophthalmology markets. It's low in Bulgaria, we heard that. It's low in Japan. It's low. Another market we look actually is in the Baltics. Lithuania has a very low rate of toric lens prescribing. That's an Eastern European ophthalmology market. And again, I mentioned about the ophthalmologist training sort of on the job, as it were, that perhaps, and I have heard it said that there is less. I think Christina Grubcheva more or less said this in the interview, that perhaps just they see less importance in soft toric prescribing. Maybe the sort of the finesse about getting the perfect visual outcome, refractive outcome, maybe is not quite does not quite have the same priority in an ophthalmology clinic than in an optometry clinic. So, as you said, great differences between markets, but many times I think we can account for these, which I think is helpful.
And so, interestingly, we talked about the differences in daily disposable prescribing, and perhaps it be a matter of affluence, because the areas that seem to be higher in dailies versus those. But should it really be that way? Is the question, I guess, because haven't we really evolved to a point where the cost of daily disposables isn't that different than reusables, especially when you factor in solutions and things like that? Is it more an education thing? Is it more educating the patient that there's not a big difference? Is it more educating the doctors or prescribers that at the end of the day, it's not that different? Or is there really still a difference in other parts of the world where the price is really significantly different?
Yeah, I think that is a good point. I think certainly my experience sounds like yours, where the difference has narrowed in recent years, and when you start to take the account of solutions, really it's a minimal difference. And certainly in countries where there's a lot of part-time wear with daily disposables, as actually in my own country. Well, in fact, it's actually daily disposables are sort of a cheaper option overall. I think you're right. I think it partly could be a communication thing. I mean, it might be in some parts of the world there is still a differential, but I do wonder, as optometrists, we are sometimes a little bit reticent to get involved with discussions around cost and presuming that people can afford things, and we just maybe don't even want to initiate the discussion sometimes, and just assume that, oh, well, this person perhaps wouldn't be able to afford whatever device, a daily disposable, for example, or something else. So yeah, maybe a little bit of education with our colleagues in some parts of the world would be worthwhile. I know that there can be frustration within the companies. I've lectured in Latin America, and a big part of some of these meetings is talking about daily disposables and extolling the benefits. That I guess it's a catch-22 when you're very familiar with them. It's a key product that is prescribed. You become very aware of the benefits, and if you're still fairly new to them, you don't prescribe them very much, then maybe you're less familiar. So we just need to sort of break that cycle, I think, and I think get more daily disposable lenses prescribed worldwide.
Yeah, I think it'll happen. It's just a little bit of a cultural difference in how we possibly move on to adapt to new technologies and new products. So one final topic on this is how patients obtain lenses. Certainly, again, there are places that we saw in the episodes where they're treated as very much medical devices. You would only get them through your doctors, to the other extreme of walking up to a vending machine and putting a card in and pulling out a box of lenses that no one has any idea whether these are the right lenses other than you hope they are. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in the regions in that regard? And did anything stand out in terms of patient safety? Are there areas where patients seem to be at risk because of their habits or their practices in this regard?
Well, yeah, there certainly were these big differences in each of the regions. Exactly as you said, Jason, we can go from a very highly regulated, you need a prescription to get your lenses, to countries where the prescription isn't required as such, but the norm is to have lenses fitted and supplied in a method that we would, I think, be familiar with, all the way through to it's much more of a free for all. Just get your lenses from a vending machine, and I guess that's a pretty shocking sort of thing for people to see who are unfamiliar with that, dealing with these, as I think happens in our two countries, as a medical device with a prescription and sort of oversight of the sale and everything else. So this is perhaps one area we discussed earlier. Can we sort of try and seek some uniformity in education and some other areas? Well, this probably was one area where it would be good to get some uniformity and the sort of a regulation of supply, to be a little more strict, perhaps in some of those markets. Again, probably difficult to do, but it might be worth us collectively spending some effort, I think, in doing that. I mean, I think we would be concerned about lack of compliance with lens care and lens wear and solutions. For example, if people are just buying the lenses very casually from a vending machine, and we know that in a minority of cases that can and will lead to problems. Now, the flip side of all this is, I guess, any consumer groups, when they hear conversations like this, I'll see that it's just what we're circling the wagons a bit. We're just defending our market and bringing about sort of limited or restricted practices. But I think that's a bit unfounded. I mean, I think you can still have a vibrant market. Certainly, we'd see that in this country, a prescription is still needed, but you can actually get your lenses from a variety of places. The market seems, very active, and presumably that sort of keeps costs down for consumers. And yet, I think it can be done with the safety and the knowledge that a prescription is required, that some sort of aftercare schedule is required in patients. There's a time limitation to the prescription, which brings about, I think, the requirement for aftercare discussion with an optometrist and all the rest of it. So, I think we can have it both ways here. We can have a safe supply system while still the market sort of operating in a reasonably active way to, give consumers what they would want, I guess, in terms of choice and choice of supply, at least, although keeping with the prescribed lens, but choice of supply, route, and modest cost, competitive pricing.
Yeah, I think the biggest concern on this kind of wild west, getting your lenses wherever you want to get them, is less so that the patient's going to end up with the wrong prescription. They could, but if they can't see, they're probably not going to wear them. Or if the lenses don't fit well, if they're not comfortable, they're not going to wear them. I think a lot of it will come down to, are these people educated on the proper care? And that's really the concern, is if I abuse these, if I use wrong products, that's where I'm opening myself up to real risk. And that education goes along with the prescription part of it through their provider. And when you circumvent that, then you miss that educational perspective that gives you successful wear with whatever product you're in.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. It breaks the link potentially, doesn't it? It breaks the link
Correct.
between the clinical professional and the patient. And yeah, you can imagine over time whether that just becomes the norm. There's a big gulf might emerge between the prescriber and the patient. And as you say, that really can't be a good thing when there can be risks to using contact lenses if it's not done appropriately and correctly.
Well, thinking back over the 3 episodes, were there any other unique revelations that came out of this that surprised you, that opened your eyes, that you weren't expecting to hear about?
Yeah, well, I think we've touched on quite a bit of these. This kind of variation as you go over one national border to the next, things are quite different. So, I guess I was aware of that, but it did bring into sort of stark relief some of these differences, the discussion. Now, perhaps one thing I hadn't perhaps thought about so much is the emergence maybe of India as an important market. There's more than a billion people live in India. Optometry is on the up in India. Some recent legal changes are sort of making optometry stronger there. And certainly our reporter, Kairi Tan in Singapore, definitely thought that India is one to watch, and be interesting to see how that plays out in coming years, because there's certainly great potential and a huge population. So yeah, something we should keep our eye on, I think, there, Jason.
And I think it makes perfect sense that what you said is completely true, and I could be wrong, but my impression of India is that it's increasingly better and better educated, and with that comes more need for refractive correction, because we're going to see myopia probably growing there like it has in other parts of the world as well. And being the second largest population country, huge potential, and at this stage, huge potential to get it right when it comes to contact lens prescribing and whatnot. So I think that's a great revelation. I think that's something we often think about, the China situation with the myopia and the explosion of ortho-K and whatnot, but I think India's kind of lost in that conversation. But I think it will have to become a bigger topic in that discussion in the years to come.
Yeah, agreed. Certainly one to watch.
Yeah. So just again, at the end of the day, what can we say about prescribing contact lenses around the world? There's one word that would summarize it. What would that be?
One word is varied. We've got varied methods by which patients will obtain the lenses, as we've discussed, various ways of that we educate students who become contact lens professionals, various prescribing trends, various penetration rates, and all the rest of it. And as I mentioned earlier on, the funny thing the ironic thing is that the person receiving lenses, that the patient just wants the same thing, right? They want to be able to see well in an effective and comfortable and safe way. And that doesn't matter where in the world they are, that's what they want. And yet somehow the systems that we have in place mean that the lenses that they ultimately get, can be quite different for a whole host of reasons around market forces locally, educational systems, pricing, and a whole bunch of sort of commercial stuff, no doubt as well. So yeah, that would be I guess my one word to sum up these last few discussions, Jason. But I think I come out of these discussions, optimistic. Maybe we can use these great variations that we see. We can start to cherry pick a little bit about what's going on in different countries and bring that elsewhere, looking at best practice. So we know that penetration rates are, very high in the US, very high in in Scandinavia. So we, well, should learn, well, what's happening there? Why is that the case? And, bring that to other parts of the world, where patients apparently are better served with, where we're getting better numbers for toric fitting, we're getting better numbers perhaps for multifocal fitting, we're doing well, let's say, with myopia control. Look at the places where that's going well, and the rest of the world can learn from it. So it does seem to me, perhaps a bit idealistically, but it does seem to me that we can look at these pockets of best practice and transplant that from one place to the others, because ultimately, something like half the world has some sort of refractive error. With 3 billion people and counting has a refractive error, and I think only around 4% of them are using contact lens. We've got this 96% of that group to go at, Jason, which is certainly going to keep people like you and I busy,
right,
the rest of our careers, and we've got plenty of work to do.
And I agree. I think it's fascinating to think that the diversity between countries and how it's done, the benefit to that is we see how doing it differently, we can take the best of the different scenarios and benefit from that. If we all did it exactly the same, perhaps we wouldn't gain that experience. So we'll spin it positively. And as we bring this episode to a close, again, I wanted to thank you for taking the controls for the last few episodes. It was wonderful to have you doing the shows. I think you did fantastic, and they were really interesting. And again, I appreciate the excellent series.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
And thank you all for joining us for another episode of CLS Live. Please join me again next month as I bring you a recap of this year's fantastic GSLS conference, which just ended a few days ago. We'll go through some of the hot topics, some of the research and revelations that came from the premier contact lens conference of the year. So thanks again, and see you then.